Let's talk a little about feminist epistemology. I guess I think that over the last 20, 30 years, which is getting to be a while now, a lot of the most important work in philosophy in many different areas has been feminist-oriented. I think that's certainly true in epistemology. One book that I particularly recommend, and I would pull out my copy and wave it around, except I think it's at my office in Carlisle, is Feminist Epistemologies, an anthology published in the early 90s, edited by Linda Martine Alcoff and Elizabeth Potter, and presenting a number of different, very compelling approaches, a number of which have been elaborated since. I think that a lot of the most important work in ethics over the last few decades has been emerged from feminist theory. A lot of the most important work in political philosophy, theory of justice, and so on, as well. And definitely in epistemology. So one thing we should, you probably heard this, but I think it's worth emphasizing. There is no singular feminist position on these issues. There's no official feminist theory of knowledge, for instance. That's one reason why Alcoff and Potter's anthology is entitled Feminist Epistemologies, real typical locution, to indicate it's a range of approaches rather than a single theory that everyone agrees on. Right. In political philosophy, for example, there are feminist theorists who are classical liberals, and there are feminist theorists who are Marxists, and there are feminist theorists who are anarchists and stuff like this. Okay, there's no one specific feminist political philosophy, although there might be there certainly are issues and concerns that all those varieties of feminism have in common. And obviously they emerge from, initially a concern with gender equality and so on. Okay, now one way to see that there's no official position in feminist epistemology is that the two papers that we're going to read, Miranda Fricker on epistemic injustice and Sandra Harding on standpoint epistemology, it's not that there might not be a way to reconcile them or a wider theoretical framework that would incorporate the insights of both, but they certainly appear to be quite in tension or almost making an opposite direction, at least initially. All right. So I think standpoint epistemology was maybe an early revolutionary development in feminist epistemology, and in one of the key concepts, and one of the key concepts in a lot of feminist epistemology, is the idea of situated knowledge, or situated knowers. Okay, so notice that if we're reading Descartes and Locke or Plato, we're talking about the universal, like it's the knower is kind of a blank, whether it's René Descartes or a hypothetical subject, seeing a pig or looking at his hands or something like that. It's supposed to be a universal, neutral human subject, and the question is neutral and universal, as traditionally philosophical questions are, or apparently are. If it's possible to have a neutral, universal point of view, one danger is that you might take yourself to have a universal, neutral point of view when actually you're infested with all kinds of prejudices or all kinds of privileges that of which you're not aware, systematically not aware. So maybe Rene Descartes was situated after all, even if he didn't, even if he thought of himself as the neutral, an example of the human self in its essence, as he tries to figure out how he knows anything, or comes to, I think, therefore I am. All right, anyone could examine that, right? He's not saying like, I can traverse this and you can't. He's saying any human being who's capable of reasoning at all could reason to this kind of conclusion and answer skepticism, I guess. So one question is, and a lot of the critical race theory makes a lot of similar observations. The question is, to what extent is our social situation, or our social status, social group memberships, and so on, relevant to how we know, and whether we know, and what we know? And again, the basic traditional position in Western epistemology is it makes no difference where you're situated. Human knowledge is just the same in any case, you know. I mean, I think if you ask Rene Descartes, are there things that black people can know that white people can't, or vice versa, that women can know that men can't, or vice versa? You'd just be like, no, man. You know, the Cartesian self is the same in all cases, I guess. All right. Although I think any epistemologist ought to admit that where you are situated affects what you know in various ways, but maybe just contingently, and maybe not how you know. So, you know, I mean, I know what the weather's like in York Springs today. That's because I'm in York Springs today. I mean, I could check on Weather Underground or something like that, but I know it, you know, and you probably don't know what the weather is like in York Springs today, because you're situated elsewhere. So there's a lot of things I know just by being where I am at the moment and being who I am at the moment, okay? So everyone can admit that. But are there systematic differences in what can be known, or even what cannot be known in different positions? Okay. Now, the standpoint approach, we're going to see an excellent example of this in Harding, but it's a really rich and elaborate discourse in epistemology. We're going to come to it after the Fricker, actually. Makes the really interesting claim that in certain respects, the condition of being oppressed is a condition of epistemic privilege. Now, if that sounds paradoxical, it ought to, right? And it's intended to, I think, basically, depending on who's doing the presenting. There's a number of figures who have explored this set of ideas in a really interesting ways. So, for example, I mean, just to take an easy set of examples, or like a sort of obvious set of examples, at least I think they are. Who understands the moral nature of slavery? The slave does, and the master does not. And I think it would be easy to prove that. Like, let's look at the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, as opposed to the discourse of slave masters about slavery in that same era, say John C. Calhoun or something like that. Right? You know, where he's presenting slavery as this benevolent institution to uplift black folks, right? Well, Frederick Douglass knows what's happening. He has to know what's happening, okay? He knows that slave masters beat their slaves, for example, okay? And he knows what that's like. He knows why they do, when they do, who they do it to, and so on, okay? Frederick Douglass understands the cruelty of slavery, and specifically, he understands the evil of the masters. And I mean, for him, one aspect of this is he understands that his master in slavery on Maryland's Eastern Shore was not a Christian in any decent sense. Okay? Like, didn't practice the golden rule at all. He owned and harmed people in myriad ways, all right? But the master believes of himself that he is a Christian. He's self-deluded. And that kind of self-delusion is typical of what we might call, social privilege, socially privileged positions. If you wanted to understand American racism, don't ask white people, ask black people, okay? I mean, ask white people, but only ask white people who have asked black people, and take it with a grain of salt. Right? There are specific motivations for white folks not to understand what racism is, not to understand how pervasive it is, not to understand their own role in it, not to understand their own privileges within it. Because they're trying to beef up their own self-image, and also those kinds of realizations that this is wrong, that this is racist or whatever, would damage the system that benefits white folks. So the claim of a kind of standpoint style claim in epistemology would be that white people do not understand racism and black people do. Okay? Now, overall, for example, white people are have been much more educated traditionally in our culture than black people. That's one feature of race privilege. So there seems to be like a privileged access to knowledge in various ways. But the claim is that the whole system of racism rests on systematic ignorance basically conscious, intentional ignorance, at least to some extent, or at least culpable ignorance in some respects, on behalf of white people. All right. Same with sexism. All right. Who understands that we live in a sexist society? Who understood a couple years ago what Me Too meant? How pervasive that whole problem was, and how badly it damaged people and is. Okay, of course, sexual harassment and abuse. You see, maybe a basic insight standpoint of epistemology is like this whole gender system, it's oppressive, exploitative, dehumanizing aspects is unknown to the men, basically, to the oppressors. Necessarily unknown. So in various ways, oppressed people, and I think this is true in various very elaborate ways, really, oppressed people are more in touch with reality than oppressive people, no matter what the educational levels and things like that are. That oppressed people in some ways have a clearer view of social reality than oppressors do. Or another way to think about this is that oppression usually involves anyway, systematic self-delusion. So one thing that an oppressor doesn't understand is that he is an oppressor and what sort of oppressor he is. Even the basic self-knowledge breaks down. So this really yields very interesting results. Maybe if you want to understand what our social system is, you should ask poor women, not male distinguished professors at Harvard. Right? Even though they got the statistics and they're sociology professors, let's say, and they know social reality. No, not really. Or they may well, have and apply even scientifically the basic self-delusions that undergird oppressive systems. Now, this set of thoughts has really led to a very interesting and elaborate discourse, I think. And it changed epistemology in certain ways. By changing our concept of S, the S that knows P, all right, and making that a specific, socially situated, embodied knower, not a neutral Cartesian subject or just a sheer human or whatever, or a sheer I or something. I mean, even what you see is partly controlled by who you are, where you are in social reality. What you see when you see a woman. You know, what do cisgender heterosexual men traditionally see when they see a woman? Maybe not really what's there, actually. Maybe not the human being. Maybe like a collection of body parts or something like that. Now, who is in touch with reality? All right. And I should say, like, a lot of this feminist epistemology emerges from and flows back into philosophy of science. And a lot of it is very interesting on that, too. Like the political situatedness of certain scientific results. Someone like Donna Haraway, really interesting theorist, author of the Cyborg Manifesto in the 1980s. She started out as a primatologist, or at least someone who's evaluating primate research. And basically she's finding, when they're studying chimps and bonobos or whatever, that this is looking at studies from the 60s and 70s of the last century, the scientists are discovering the whole sort of Western gender system in every colony of chimps that they study. And they're actually ignoring most of their own data to do that. So you get a feminist critique of like specific scientific studies that show the ways that the privilege of the scientists have affected their interpretation of the data. Right? You could move that toward a kind of relativism, like what you know is relative to where you are socially, or women know stuff and men don't, vice versa, or whatever. But you could move it toward you could defend a position like that, and many do, including Harding, I think, as a way to get a stronger, better objectivity. Right? It's the fact that privilege introduces systematic distortions that lead to objectively false beliefs. And so, for one thing, we might need a lot of different voices, even in apparently neutral scientific inquiries. A lot of voices of different kinds of people, just to check each other in order to have like a successful knowledge-producing institution or a successful science. But it's not the case necessarily that this idea of truth or objective truth, or even truth that is in some sense the same for everyone, that's not necessarily being rejected in these views, although sometimes it is. All right. Now it's interesting, like I say, that Fricker, who we're going to get into now. I'm not on Friday. I guess we'll have a class, and I'll go through the Fricker in detail. But I just want to kind of preview the basic idea, or the basic ideas. Miranda Fricker is sort of as eminent as any philosopher at the moment. I think, like, she's really read a lot. And she's become a very, very eminent figure with this set of ideas. All right. And we're reading a paper of hers from 2003. This is before her book, although it incorporates ideas that became her book, Epistemic Injustice. And what she does in 2003 is she moves directly to this set of kind of political critiques of knowledge directly out of the virtue epistemology discourse that we've been looking at. So she's working on Zagzebski and Greco and stuff like this. And she's she's framing the gender problems of knowledge in those terms, in terms of like, what sorts of believers do we want to be? What sort of believers ought we to be? What features of character ought we to cultivate in ourselves if we want to reach the truth in our beliefs, and so on. So that's the framework she comes out of, and like I say, virtue epistemology really has been quite dominant, and obviously interfaces with feminist epistemology over the last 20 years or whatever it is. All right. And this is interestingly in tension, I think, with the standpoint framework. Although, like I say, I think they could probably be integrated in various interesting ways. Probably someone has tried. I better go check the lit on this. So Fricker's idea of epistemic injustice is really quite a powerful idea. And it brings together the political, the moral, and the epistemological in a powerful way that people really have found compelling. Her basic question is, who gets believed by whom and how and why? Who has credibility? This is kind of a classic epistemological problem, although maybe it hasn't gotten quite as much focus as it deserves in some ways. Like, when is it rational to accept someone's authority, or when is it rational to believe something in virtue of the fact that someone has said it? Whom should you believe? Who has credibility? How could credibility be established? How does credibility or credible authority bequeath justification? So how can I come to know, for example, that the climate is changing? By listening to scientific authorities. I'm not going out and having all the sense data I would need or whatever. Like, okay, so there's many scientific theories that I probably accept or roughly accept or nod along with anyway, that I don't even hardly understand the terms that are being thrown around, and much less have I examined the data or tried to match up the data with the reality or something like that. I'm accepting a lot of what I accept on authority. In fact, when I read the newspaper in the morning, most of the events that they assert I don't have any witness, relation to. I'm accepting it because it's in the newspaper. Trump said X, or, there's been they're at war in Sudan or whatever, I haven't seen that. Right? I haven't even talked to anyone who's been involved, actually, but I'm taking their authority. So it's a pretty central feature of human epistemic life, is to accept things because you are told them. Okay, so under what conditions is that a good idea, and what conditions is it not? And there's been a fair amount of work on that, and there was before Fricker. Like, what does tend to establish credibility? It's probably the kind of things that you would imagine. Like having access to the facts in some way, as well as features of character, like being honest and so on, like honestly representing your own views and so on. These sorts of things might qualify you to have certain epistemic authority with regard to certain material, okay, or in a certain area. Now, one thing Fricker points out, and it seems very obvious when she says it, and people had been saying it in different ways, but maybe not so systematically, and in the philosophical discourse, who gets believed is partly a matter, or even largely a matter of social privilege, right? Part of racism, part of sexism, is that women or black folks have reduced credibility in social circulation or whatever, or like maybe in institutions of power and so on. They're less believed as witnesses even of their own experience, which would be really ironic if the standpoint insight is right. Let's say black folks understand racism and white folks don't, basically, for very good reasons. So that actually, with regard to racism, you're much better off believing black people than white people overall. But meanwhile, we have structures that make black people less credible in public space, or like in white spaces, I guess, than white people. Right? And that's a fundamental dimension of oppression. Who gets believed? Who speaks with credibility? Who has epistemic authority? Epistemic authority mirrors other forms of authority, economic, or other forms of privilege, economic, political, and so on. Right? So Fricker argues that a fundamental dimension of sexist oppression is that men have a kind of presumed credibility that women often lack. And she favors kind of literary and film style examples. Her example is drawn from a novel or the film The Talented Mr. Ripley. And, a woman in that situation who actually does know who did the murder and stuff like this is just dismissed as being hysterical, overly emotional, right? Not sufficiently rational. These are things that men have been saying about women for decades or centuries, right? And there are ways of dismissing women as knowers or even as credible or authoritative representers of their own experience. So this is one example of how this move toward things like virtue epistemology really have expanded the field. The feminist epistemology does that independently of virtue epistemology anyway. Now we start thinking about the political implications of knowledge. We start thinking about the social circulation of knowledge. We start thinking about who, gets eliminated from the realm of knowledge, who gets listened to, who gets believed, and the role of all that in structural oppression. The ways it emerges from structural oppression, like differential and irrational credibility distributions, emerge from structural oppression and feed into structural oppression, right? Are central to it in certain ways. This makes epistemology a real important discipline. It's not like a little game where we go like, yeah, do I know that I exist? I don't know. We go like, who will listen to me? Who ought we to listen to? Whose voice ought to be heard? And how have those questions fed into a history of racist and sexist oppression? Now, it's kind of, like I say, there's an interesting tension because Fricker's view tends to portray women and members of minority groups and so on as epistemically disprivileged, okay? Just specifically because they don't have as much testimonial credibility or authority as, white cisgender men, right? Whereas in the standpoint framework, like Harding, the oppressed position is the epistemically privileged position. It yields the possibility of gaining knowledge that is unavailable to the oppressor. Now, those could both be true. They could be true in different dimensions of knowledge on different occasions or among different groups and so on. but they are interestingly in tension. Are women, for example, on these feminist views, disabled as knowers and underprivileged as knowers, or are they especially privileged as knowers? Like I say, I think those can be made compatible, but it's an interesting project. I think there's important insights both ways around, actually. That's why I think I probably should try to figure out how they can be made compatible, because I think they're both true, at least to a significant extent. Okay, and like I said, these are some of the most interesting and important developments in epistemology over the last several decades. So I'll see you on Friday to talk through the Fricker paper in more detail.